Everybody has a great idea somewhere in them. They just need to do the work to find it.
Welcome back to the Wild Business Growth Podcast presented by Hippo Direct. This is your place to hear from a new entrepreneur or innovator every single Wednesday morning who's turning wild ideas into wild growth. I'm your host, Max Branstetter, digital marketing dude at Hippo Direct, and you can reach me at max@hippodirect.com for help using your podcast as a marketing tool. This is episode number 90, and today's guest is Tamsen Webster. In addition to being my favorite Tamsen, she is the idea whisperer, and we dive into her concept of the red thread in this interview. She also is an amazing keynote speaker who's keynoted at Content Marketing World, and she's a messaging strategist where she consults clients like Verizon and Johnson & Johnson. She has served as the executive producer of TEDx Cambridge, the premier TED event in New England, and she also has spent 13 years as a Weight Watchers leader. Let's find our zen with Tamsen. Enjoy the show. Alrighty, we are here with one of the most enjoyable people you'll ever hear from, Tamsen Webster. How you doing today, Tamsen?
Well, I'm fabulous after that intro. Now I need to live up to it.
Yeah, that was just, to light a fire under you right away. So yeah, no pressure here.
No pressure, none.
So I'm sure you get this question a lot, but I'm just dying to know as well. So you're definitely the first Tamsen I've ever spoke to. Do you know where your name came from?
I do. It is. It's an old Celtic name. It's an old Celtic name. No, I know it, and you can't.
Damn it!
It is. Darn it! I know. It's an old Celtic name. It is a feminine version of Thomas. And if anyone has seen it before, it has some frequency as a nickname for Thomasina. But if you were to pronounce Thomasina or Thomasine in Gaelic, as so far as I understand it, it comes out as Tomashane. And so Tamsen, of course, is a simplification of that. So there you go.
Wow. There's my Gaelic and Celtic lesson of the day.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Your husband's name is Tom. Does that ever get confusing?
Never.
All right.
Nope.
Just checking.
It doesn't. Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes people try to like benefer us or whatever with like Thompson, but
wow.
Yeah. I don't know what that means really. Like, have we met? Have we gotten to some level of like pop idol stardom? Like,
I
we're
think so.
the Websters.
I think I discovered you from the pop chart, so that's probably where it came from.
That's where most people find me. So
yeah, cool. All right. Well, we're going to get into a lot about your famous or infamous red thread that you've created, as well as being an idea whisperer, which we'll just have to whisper for that entire portion because, for the sake of corniness. But before we get into that, I want to get into a little bit about your background. So you had a great run at Weight Watchers.
I did. I worked for Weight Watchers for 15 years as what at that point was called a leader. They're now called coaches. And I did that in my free time. So evening, weekends, mornings, while I had my full-time job as a brand and marketing strategist.
So what made you get involved as a leader/coach in Weight Watchers in the first place?
Well, 20 years ago, I finished losing 50 pounds and I wanted to keep that. Thanks. I wanted to keep that off. And I knew that how I was wired, that one of the best ways for me to do that was to help other people do the same thing. One of my guiding principles is the kind of classic proverb of what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So I knew the way that I'm wired, that there was no way that I could talk to other people about losing and maintaining weight and learning and living a healthy lifestyle if I was not also doing the same thing. And it worked. So I have maintained that 50-pound weight loss through 2 kids and 20 years. So
wow, that's incredible. Well, congrats again. I'm just going to keep congratulating you. So congrats.
Well, thanks.
But that makes a lot of sense, and it's true. It really clearly served as a an accountability method as well. So it's cool that it worked from you from that standpoint. What did you learn from Weight Watchers on the business or marketing side of things?
Oh my, everything. Pretty much everything. And I mean that seriously, because if you think about the situation that I as a leader was in, which was my job, was I had a group of people in front of me, 30 to 45 minutes a week. And the groups ranged anywhere from, let's say, 10 people up to a couple of my meetings were over 100. And my job every week was to help them to think differently enough about some aspect of their eating or of their life or of their health or their mindset, that they would then do something different and keep doing something different. And I think in a lot of ways, this is what marketing is all about. And essentially, and what we who've started businesses are really all about. We have found a way to do something different, and we want to help other people do that different thing long term. And so the process of week in, week out for, it was really 13 years that I was a leader in front of the room, figuring out what worked and what didn't to create that kind of long-term shift in thinking and behavior. And so I took those lessons and I applied them to my full-time job. I had realizations that, for instance, nothing would work at the market level if it didn't work at the individual level first. That pain is the enemy of long-term change, and yet it is the focal point of most marketing and sales messaging. And so I just took some of these realizations and applied them to what I was doing in my full-time job, my official job. And it made a big difference. My marketing was much more effective. We ended up, when I was working with nonprofits, we ended up raising more money, ended up getting more things done and accomplishing more when I applied those lessons that I learned at Weight Watchers.
Well, yeah, you're a shining example of that. And I think that's a thing we see a lot, but you don't see people dig deep into it often. So I'm curious, what tips do you have for taking skills from one line of work and then transferring it to something that's actually quite different?
I think it comes in trying to find the core lesson of whatever's happening and realizing that it isn't just, okay, I'm helping people lose weight over here and I'm helping people
gain weight.
Decide to give. And over here, I'm helping people decide whether or not to give money to the medical school where I was working. Those are fundamentally different things, actually. The more that I could look at it and say, well, what is the core thing that's happening? Well, the core thing is happening is that I have to figure out how to introduce new information to this person in a way that they're likely to accept and act on. I have to get them to understand the information and agree with the information and act on the information. And in both cases, that thing is happening. Once I had that realization that there really wasn't anything fundamentally different between helping people lose weight and finding a marketing message that was successful, I really just started to actively look for those times where I was like, well, what's happening here? And whether it was marketing and I could bring it over to what was happening in the meeting room, or whether it was something that I was doing at Weight Watchers that was working, I would look for how I could bring it over. So I think it's kind of like, how Aesop's fables, there's a story and then there's a moral of the story at the end. I would kind of look at all my experiences in both parts of my life, actually all parts of my life, and say, okay, well, that's the story. Whatever the experience was the story. And then I would just kind of say, well, what's the moral of that story? What's the lesson I can learn from this thing? Because once I started to bring things down to those lessons, well, then those lessons could be applied all over the place. And that's what I would suggest, is try to find the lesson in every experience.
So the moral of the story here is to find the lesson in every experience.
Correct.
All right.
That's right.
You really put me to the test there.
I know.
It's true. It makes me think back. Well, you mentioned fables. It makes you think to any little kid story that you've ever heard. I'm sure that's the proper term, little kid story, but any children's story that you've ever heard. And there's a lesson that you can apply to anything in that. So if you just kind of use that as a metaphor or analogy for your life experiences, then think how that can apply to the next thing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's why we've used stories for millennia to transfer ideas, because they are concrete, they are evocative, they show the relationships, they show a starting point, they show an ending point, they show what motivations were, who was going on. And so that's one of the reasons why we tell folk tales and fables to little kids, is because we're trying to get them to understand some of these generally accepted life lessons. But it's also the reason why all information, when presented in a story form, and we can talk more about that, is more successful, because our brains, even before we have words, are putting things into the structure of a story. We're trying to figure out, who are these people? What do they want? What happens as a result of them pursuing that thing? All of those things our brains are constantly trying to figure out. So if you realize that essentially you're living a story at every moment, and your brain is constantly creating a story out of what you're doing, that there by definition are lessons in everything that you do, because that's simply how people's brains work. Right.
And put in other terms, whether you know it or not, you are living a fairy tale. So
correct. Absolutely. Yes. We're all on a quest. We're all in our rags to riches story. I mean, it's just really like all the different ways that you can think about it. But we absolutely are the central character of an ongoing narrative. And I find that just deeply intriguing. And that's really at the core of my work, is figuring out what is the story in which you are living right now, and how do you get that out to somebody else? And that may sound kind of like woo woo and whatever, but
woo woo.
Your business, I know, woo woo, but your business, if you've started your business, or if you represent a business as a marketer, is the representation of someone having lived an experience that taught them a lesson, and they did a thing as a result. Like that, you're like, if you started your own business, you're out there saying, hey, there's things that I want to accomplish for myself. How can I do that? What things can I bring to bear? When you're thinking about what you're actually going to do, you're going to think, like, who's out there? What problems do they solve? What do I have an answer to? We need to be able to figure this out. These are all elements of story. And so if you can really break down those elements of the narrative and understand, like, what was the narrative that brought you to your founding your business or creating a new product or service, and then if you can communicate that narrative in an effective way to your customers, your clients, your audiences, well, then what we're doing is creating this we're really zapping this idea from our brain to theirs with as little distortion as possible. And isn't that what we're trying to do whenever we communicate, is try to get a message from our heads into somebody else's with as little distortion as possible. And the best way to do that is to is to aim your message right into the story center of somebody else's head.
Bam, zap. I like the vivid verbs there.
Yeah. Kapow.
We're living a comic book as well.
That's right.
So you kind of alluded to this, and you're really good at kind of teasing or hinting at the main story behind things, no pun intended with story. But you have created this monster I mentioned earlier called the red thread. Mm-hmm. So can you take us through, let's just start off with kind of a beginner's guide to what the red thread is and means.
So at its simplest, the red thread is what makes something make sense. It's a theme or a through line. It's the main idea of something. And I picked up the phrase, the red thread, working with some clients a few years ago who were in Northern Europe, in Sweden, actually. And there it's an everyday phrase for them, where people will say, well, what's the red thread of this? And, they want to hear, like, what's the main idea? Or that companies would say, well, our red thread is X. And what you would put in the X is what you're driving, purpose, passion, mission would kind of come in that. And so at its simplest, that's what a red thread is. It's the unifying idea of something. To get a little bit more specific, the way I like to think about it is, if you've ever asked somebody a question and they gave you an answer and you didn't quite understand. So you're like, but what do you mean? Like, what's going on? Or you struggle to understand how their answer was actually an answer to your question, what you were looking for there, or you were looking for the red thread. You were looking for a connection. You were looking for a logical connection between the question that you have and the answer that you found, or the answer you've been given. And so to get one level deeper than that, what the
we're just going to keep going here. I like it.
Well, it's just kind of making sure that people are tracking along. So the red thread process that I developed, the red thread method, so kind of like the red thread, capital R, capital T, is both the output and the process. So it's the process of figuring out how to connect, in this case, your clients, your customers, your audience's questions to your ideas, products, and services as the answer. It is the connection. And then the red thread method that I've developed is essentially, how do you establish that connection?
Okay. Yeah. So it's really in other terms, it's kind of like the secret sauce, or like the thing that gels everything together and makes it easy to digest or understand.
Yeah. It's the case for your idea. Or in whatever form your idea takes. Like sometimes that's a message, sometimes it's a product or service, but the red thread is the case for your idea. And more specifically, it's not your case for your idea, it's your audience's case for your idea. It is the story they'll tell themselves about why your idea, your product or service is the right one for them.
So how can you use this red thread in terms of getting your story of yourself or your company brand out there and use it to your advantage from a marketing or storytelling standpoint?
Well, ultimately, because it is essentially recreating and kind of surfacing your point of view. It's surfacing that ongoing narrative. You remember what I was saying before? Like, we're living a story, and really this process helps you surface what the elements of that ongoing story are.
Right.
Because each of those elements is distinctive to you, and particularly how you put them together. I'd say one of the primary things that finding the red thread of something does is, in addition to helping you establish why your thing is the right answer for somebody or some company, it is actually a very powerful source of truly understanding your points of differentiation and therefore ultimately your value proposition. And so think of like where you could use a red thread as any place where you need to make a value proposition, either of your company as a whole or of a particular action, clear. So that can be anything from, your marketing materials. What are the big messages that you're putting out there? So brand positioning statements, it's often as I use those with clients, they use the red thread with clients to help them come up with that. But we also use it all the way down to, how do you structure content that you're generating day in, day out as a content marketing strategy that is still consistent with your overall narrative and yet still very powerful? Use it with sales messaging. I work a lot with startup clients, et cetera, to help them phase phase value proposition across all stages of a sales funnel. I do a lot of work with B2B companies. So, what does it sound like when you first introduce somebody to your product or service, when you first talk to them? How is that different than when you get moved, down the chain of decision-making to either somebody who's, let's say to somebody who's now less technically minded than the first person that you talk to? How do you keep the urgency and the importance of the idea true when now all of a sudden you can't rely on jargon and those kinds of things? How do you then turn that in, all of that information, into your final presentation and that final proposal? How do you make sure your value proposition shows up loud and clear through all of that? So there's a huge number of places to put it, and basically the only thing that limits it is whether or not you're in a situation where you need to explain your idea. And anytime that you need to do that, this is a way to do that powerfully.
Right. Yeah. And I feel like that comes up quite a bit when you think about examples or case studies of companies, or it could be an individual person that does a really, really good job with the red thread. What comes to mind? Are there a couple examples you can share with us?
Sure. I think it's useful probably to come up with people who aren't my clients so you can see consistency. One of them is one of my favorite brands, and it may not be familiar to everybody, but it's actually a clothing brand called Diane von Furstenberg, who is still alive. She's the founder and the original designer of like the wrap dress, is much what most people know of her.
Yeah, you're talking about my wardrobe.
Yeah, exactly. It's very flattering on you.
Thank you. Oh, come on. I wasn't fishing for compliments there.
I love Diane von Furstenberg. I love her clothing. But I have also now for coming on 8-9 years been a big fan of the marketing, because with a couple little unfortunate sidesteps in the last 10 years where they tried a new creative director, whatever. They have been so true to the original kind of narrative of Diane herself and what she was trying to accomplish with her clothing, that there's just been this incredible through line, a red thread of timeless, easy, elegant clothing. But everything that they do, from how they represent themselves on the website, to the way they communicate, to the way they use social, to the way they use all of these things, is just, all of it is about creating this very rich narrative beyond just the clothes themselves. And they've been doing that for years. And I think part of that is because there's such a clear vision from Diane herself that they've had that ability to kind of articulate that narrative in a way that a lot of companies don't. So I would say that's kind of one of the first examples that comes to mind. But I'd say an example that isn't a clothing brand, or even a B2C brand, because I think it's useful to think about B2B. I would think about B2B brand that really does this well. Again, not a client, so I like to point. I think it's always sometimes trust me, I'm sure I will talk about my clients, but I always think it's nicer when you can say, hey, look, you can see this concept elsewhere. And if you want that kind of effect, hey, this process will help you. But
right. These are all the people I haven't helped.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say that, a company that does it well, that actually bridges B2B and B2C, is 3M, right? So we know 3M from like tape and Post-it notes, but the application of what they do is so good. And this is one of those places where they have a beautiful tagline that really does capture their red thread in my mind. Their tagline is "Science Applied to Life." And I think if you know the history of 3M, they started as, the M's stand for like Minnesota Mining Company.
Yeah, I knew it was a lot of. I just know everything with Minnesota has so many M's in it. It's a world record.
Yeah, it's all the M's. But the history of it is like that. They have always been about that, and so, which is one of the reasons why I like to point them out as having, it's one of the rare great taglines, because it really is true to what they do, but it's actually distinctive and congruent with who they are, how they see the world, the narrative that they've been building and are continuing to build. And I think that's a key piece. So I would point to those two off the top of my head.
Yeah. Well, those are both great examples because they're in such different industries and they're both really powerful brands. I think what speaks to me about 3M is they are, of course, one of the biggest companies in the world, and they do so many different things. I mean, I remember working on a project for them back when I was in business school, and doing research for that, I was like, what products does 3M not have? Like, they literally have everything.
Yeah.
But the point of even saying that is they have so many different products and so many different lines of business, yet they're still able to get their tagline down to something that's so powerful and so succinct. And you know what they're about overall, even though they're in, everything from Post-it notes to, originally named after mining. Like, right. That's a really good one there. I'm curious how you use this firsthand. So this might be kind of an example, but I do want to dive more into it. I mentioned earlier how you call yourself an idea whisperer.
Yes. Well,
so
I call me that only because a client called me that, because otherwise I would feel like a complete jackass if I'm like, you know what, I'm going to go call myself an idea whisperer. I feel like I can use it because someone else, like a client, called me that once upon a time. And then I said jokingly to another client, I'm like, oh, it's funny, this client called me idea whisperer. And they're like, no, yes, that's exactly what you do. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll go with that then.
No, I definitely, I'm not saying you should feel like a jackass, but I was curious how that name came about. So that explains it. But what do you like about the term? Because it's unique and it's memorable. And I feel like it just ties really back to what you're all about.
Well, yes, which is why when she said that, I was like, oh, that's awesome. I love that. Yeah, exactly. Because I don't introduce myself. I don't say, like, hey, I'm Tamsen Webster. I'm an idea whisperer. Because again, jackass. But what I think is appealing about it to other people is that, the people who I'm really for are the people who know they have a big idea. They know it can have a massive impact in the world in some way. And again, idea, and I classify idea on what is like, as long as you think it's big enough for me. But I really work best with companies and people who have an idea that's bigger than themselves. They're not just doing it to make money. That's great, but like they're trying to do things that will really help change people's lives. And oftentimes, like you have the idea, you know it's powerful, and then there's just people aren't getting it. Like it's just not like, you know, it's awesome and you just can't get it out there. I think I think what's appealing to people about the idea whisper piece is this idea that somehow that idea can get pulled out of you without losing its power. And that's really what I try to do when I'm working with my clients is find that power of the idea and then figure out how do we present that power as cleanly, as clearly, and as powerfully as possible. And so I think that's why it has appeal to other people, is that I think that there's a lot of people out there who see the potential in their ideas, and for whatever reason, they're struggling with turning that potential into a reality.
Yeah, you can feel your passion with it. When was the first time you knew that you really wanted to hone in this idea and message crafting space? Because you're really, really good at it.
Well, I would say, looking back, I think I realized it a lot sooner than I did than I would say now. Like, I don't think I realized it at the time, but what would happen is, like, really early in my career, I had, like, even my first job out of grad school, I was working as a management consultant at a change management consulting firm. So we did a lot of culture change and organizational reorganizations, mergers and acquisitions, those kinds of things. And as a very junior consultant, which they called research associates, I was in charge of kind of the communication strategy, like the communication side of those things, because that had been my background in undergrad and in graduate school. And my MBA is in organizational behavior with a focus on management communications, and my undergrad is in marketing. And so they put me in charge of, like, well, let's figure out this communication piece. And I just, at the time, what I was developing was, like, how do we find the power in an organization? I can see that now. You know, when I kind of switched out of that and went back to my first love, which was museums and the arts organizations for a while, and I was in charge of the marketing again, the part that I always enjoyed was the early stage messaging piece, the early stage of figuring out what's powerful about this organization, what's powerful about this idea, what's powerful about this exhibition. How do we connect it? How do we connect it to the audience? How do we get them to see that power? That part of my job, I always loved, and I never loved the execution part. I never loved, and it doesn't mean that I don't write and all of that. I do, but I didn't love figuring out, well, we're gonna put 3 blog posts up on this channel, and then I was like,
that sounds exactly like me, but yeah,
they said, just shoot me in the face. Like, I was just not interested in that. And so, and so what I found was that over the course of my career, I kept swinging tighter and tighter and tighter to that piece of the job that I loved the most, which was the idea, which was the message piece. You know, when I moved from organizations to agencies, that was a first big narrowing, because instead of doing all of the marketing for, you know, all of Harvard Medical School fundraising, or all of the marketing for a performing arts college, or all of the marketing and thinking around exhibitions at a museum, I could think about, and when the first place I went was a brand strategy firm. Like, we could think just about the brand, just about that piece of it. And I work with an advertising agency. I was in charge of this was about 10 years ago now. So this is in the early days of social and community. Yeah. And so with that brand background, I was like, well, what I love figuring out is, what's the idea that we need to be able to, what's the idea that's big enough, that has legs, that's going to hold up over day in, day out content strategy, social posting, all of that. Next job was a boutique sales messaging and training, sales presentation training firm. So narrowing it even further. Now it was just the message piece. And then when I started my own business about 4 years ago now, I was like, well, this is the piece I'm going to do. Depending on who I talk to, I describe it differently, but it's essentially what I would call presentation strategy. In order to do that, you have to know, what is the idea? How are you going to present it as powerfully as possible? Depending on whether that's a spoken presentation, like in a keynote, or in a sales kickoff, or is it a casual spoken thing like a sales conversation, or is it written? Are we talking about marketing copy or sales documents or white papers or blog posts or status updates? How can we get that idea out there in its most powerful way? So it really was just me shedding over time the stuff that I didn't love about my job. And I just made a conscious effort to find, every time that I moved, it was about finding a job that allowed me to widen the percentage of time that I spent on the thing that I liked the most.
Yeah, it's a really good way to narrow down and find your niche. How would you characterize how this, I know, not very descriptive bubble of idea or message crafting has changed over time? Like when you think back to when you first got involved in it to when you really ultimately totally focus on it now.
Interesting. What a thought-provoking question. I love it.
Oh, thank you. That's a great compliment.
I would say that it's a lot of I would say it tracks a lot with the shift in marketing as well. Meaning, 20 years ago when I first started, I came out of school and first started doing this work, I think brands and companies and individuals could get away with, well, here's my idea, here's the brand, deal with it. Like, this is the message, go. It was much more brand focused. It was much more organization focused, because we were still very much 20 years ago, most of the forms of communication were broadcast. And I don't just mean broadcast like TV. I mean, it was, let's write a thing. You're going to go pick up a magazine, and then you're going to read it. And so there just was a lot of asynchronous broadcast type messaging. And that meant that brands and organizations could kind of ignore the impact, like how the audience would actually react to it. And this is one of those lessons that I learned from Weight Watchers was, we cannot forget how somebody is going to actually work. And I think I said it earlier, like, something will not work at the market level if it doesn't work at the individual level first. Yeah. And so even before social started to come up, I was kind of looking at it like, well, we have to actually start not from what we want to say, but what is it that they're looking to hear? And I don't mean what we wish they were looking to hear. I mean, what are they looking for right now? And whether that is, a very simple question like, how can we make more money? Or it can be things like, when I worked at a performing arts college, how can I be sure that I'm not consigning my artistic child to a lifetime of debt and failure?
That's one way to put it.
But but you have to start with what their active questions are right now, and you have to bring that forward. And so I started to see that early. I certainly saw it when social started to come up, and then all of a sudden, not only, so now we had this kind of layering and we have to pay attention to the audience, what it's going to work for them. Social started to break the asynchronous piece, and now we had to be synchronous. And so what I've really seen shift over time, and I say that a lot of people still haven't made that shift, frankly, is that this really thinking much more from the audience perspective and what they need to hear, and really starting with what their world is right now, and drawing the path to your message rather than you trying to push their message out there. That's the big shift that I have seen happen. The need has shifted. I don't know that companies and individuals that are putting messages out there have followed that shift yet. But that's the work that I try to do, is to say, hey, this world has changed. You cannot do any of this way anymore. And I think even a lot of the traditional approaches to branding are just absolutely ass backwards, frankly.
I've never heard those two words together, and I love it. I love it. Thank you. Also, that was an incredibly thought-provoking answer. So thank you for kind of taking us through your mindset through all that. It's so true. I think it's interesting because obviously the marketing channels, or, just channels in general, have changed a ton, but some of these principles can still apply in your idea and story, and we'll say red thread as well, are always important throughout all this. Imagine you started your own podcast. You're growing your brand, sharing your expertise, maybe even your terrible puns, and meeting fascinating people. That is awesome. Now, imagine all the hours you've lost every week due to the podcast's demands. Not so awesome. I am your podcast producer. Email me at max@hippodirect.com. So let's switch gears a little bit and let's get to a section on inspiration and creativity. So when you think about it, what do you do to stay creative?
Oh, that's easy.
Easy.
Yeah, it is actually.
I have never been more offended. I'm just kidding.
No. Because so here's the thing. I define my favorite definition of creativity is the ability to draw connections between unexpected things. Right? That's my definition of creativity. You can see something over here, you see, and for whatever reason, like the creative piece comes when you're like, I'm going to take this thing from over here and this thing from over here, and I'm going to put them together. And it's the inspiration to do that or to see those connections.
Well, that's exactly before you go on, that's exactly what you were talking about earlier between Weight Watchers and your other job. So that's like, you live and breathe this stuff.
I do. It's funny. And because I don't know if I've always lived and breathed it or it was formalized at one point, because my other undergraduate degree, so I have one in marketing, but I have another undergraduate degree in American Studies. And American Studies is the study of American cultures, you might imagine, but it's actually much more about the process of how to study than anything else. So the way the American Studies works is that you pick a time period. For me, I picked the intra-war period between 1918 and 1940, 41. So between World War I and World War II. And because I just love that era, the post-prohibition era, pre-war. And you look at it from every possible angle, and you look at all the connections that you can find about, you're looking at it through the arts, you're looking at it from the biography of major players, you're looking at it from an economic standpoint, you're looking at it historically of what actually happened, but you're looking at everything just to see how all of it kind of makes sense together. And like I said, I don't know that if I was attracted to American Studies because that was already how my brain works, or once that I did that, I was like, this makes a ton of sense. I'm going to do everything this way. I honestly don't know.
That's the voice of your brain, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. It's fun. I have many voices in my brain. Have I told you about my Bostonian alter ego named Karen O'Sullivan? That's a whole other story.
No. I think I have a future podcast interview with Karen coming up.
We probably do. So all of that comes into play with the fact that I love doing a couple of things every day. One is that I read every day in one form or another. My mornings always start with my reading the Washington Post, New York Times, and then my Feedly string of 300 RSS feeds. Just curious, like what's going on, what are things happening. And then I flag those for sharing, and I share 2 every weekday on my hashtag swipe file. Just kind of interesting things that I find. Just interesting stories, studies, examples, pictures, things that I think could be potentially useful for people who are trying to articulate their ideas or present their ideas in some way. And some of it's just silly, but it's just things that I find interesting as I'm going through. I always say that if I were to come back as an animal, it would be a magpie.
I knew you were going to say that.
The intellectual magpie, just kind of like find what's shiny and various ideas. And then the other thing that I do every day is a crossword puzzle. I do the New York Times crossword puzzle every day. And because it's actually, it's an additional exercise in that kind of lateral thinking. It just keeps my brain looking at things so the reading helps me just draw random connections between things. And increasingly with the wide variety of clients that I serve, it's amazing how often I can be talking to somebody who's working on culture change. I'm like, this actually reminds me of this thing I was working on with this person who works with fisheries in Philippines about how they got them, to stop all overfishing the same space. People are like, how do you know that? And I'm like, oh, don't even. It's a long story. But the crossword puzzle I find is just it's a good way to keep my brain in that pattern of there's another way to look at this. What else is, what's missing? What could work here? All those things taken together that's why I said it was easy. I'm like, oh, I know exactly how to answer this question. This is how I do it. I make sure that I have as many connections. I have as many sources of potential connections as possible out there. And then, doing crosswords just allows me to kind of keep that muscle of my brain of making those connections active.
Wow. That's incredible. So many people, when I ask about creativity, really take some time to think about it. And it can take a lot of thought and narrowing down to, okay, what actually, helps kind of free my mind in that sense. But you were like right on it. You were, you knew what to say, but I think there's some common things in what you said that I hadn't really thought about until now. The biggest thing that stuck out to me was, crossword puzzles are, when you look at it like in its most plain, boring way possible, it's just a random collection of words, a random collection of answers. Like they don't, unless there's like a specific theme for that specific one.
And even so, even on a themed puzzle, it's only ever going to be 4 or 5 answers that are tied to it. So
right.
You're right. It is basically a random collection of words.
Right. Do you know something about crossword? Yeah. But with that, I think they are inherently creative, because back to your definition of creativity, if you're connecting random things or connecting things that aren't really associated with each other, crossword is like just a mini exercise that you can do. Some people I've heard do it daily, and you can just have a little explosion of creative thinking that who knows how that can apply to your workday or whatever else you're doing that day. So definitely that's really cool that you do that.
Thanks. Yeah, I love it. And that's I've turned my sons onto it too. So they're 9 and 11, and my older son, I was talking to him last night. He was like, well, when you come over, could you not do the crossword today before you come over so that we could do it together? I was like, all right, this means you're going to slow down my time, buddy. But yes. I didn't say the thing about the time to him. I'm like, no. I mean, I was like, of course I can, you do get competitive with yourself about like how fast you could do them. But I would spend hours on it with my kids if they enjoyed it. And so far they do. And I don't want to ruin that for them. So I'm going to keep them doing crosswords as long as they want to.
Yeah, it makes sense. As long, and you can work up some good fake answers too. Like if you're working on one at the time they're talking to you, just be like, yeah, sure, sweetie, whatever. Yeah. Hope your kids aren't listening. Let's get to a fan favorite segment called the Wild Business Shoutout of the Week.
The Wild Business Shoutout of the Week.
That is awesome. Okay, yay.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm about to be like Billboard Hot 100 with that. But Wild Business Shoutout of the Week, this is where we talk about a brand or campaign that caught our attention. And there's something involving, well, I guess in some form, a gecko, but much more than that. You mind talking about the example that you thought of?
Yeah, the example that I thought of, and because I just think it's brilliant and unexpected and counter conventional wisdom in so many ways, is Geico's, well, most recently their resurrection in sequel form of some of their famous commercials, like the raccoons and the beavers and those kinds of things. They've brought back the camel a couple times.
Oh God, never forget that one. Yeah.
But what I love about one of the reasons why I think Geico is so interesting and why I wanted to give a shout out is because they do and have done that thing I was talking about that nobody else does for years. And what I mean by that is they have continually thought about what do different groups of people that might be their customers and clients, what would they pay attention to, how they pay attention to it. And what's fascinating to me is that at any given time, they probably have 3, 4, 5 different campaigns going simultaneously.
Oh, I know they're crazy big spenders too. Like they're consistently among the top.
Well, Warren Buffett owns them, so that's not hard, but
or it might explain a thing or two.
Yeah. But think about everybody who tells you that your brand has to be like, one big concept all the time. And yet the only thing that's consistent about Geico, other than the use of their logo, is, 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on your car insurance. That's it. Yes. Only those two things are consistent. And there's often some level of humor or whatever. But if you look at their print ads or their out of home ads, they're not funny. They're not even tied into their TV stuff. And so what's fascinating to me and to me that Geico is the exception that proves the rule that you don't actually need to have like this huge, all-encompassing, cohesive brand that everybody in the world totally understands. They just need to find in your product or service the thing that connects with them. So one of the ways I explain this is a lot of times, like the story that we've been told about branding is that we have to figure out this big thing. And I think of that like it's the reverse parable of the elephant. And what I mean by that is everybody says you have to figure out what the whole elephant looks like. I'm like, no, you don't. The only people to whom that whole brand, that whole elephant needs to make sense to is the brand itself. That's it. That's the only place. Other than that, as long as somebody who's looking for a tusk grabs your tusk, that's what you care about. And you need to know how it connects to the rest of it, just in case they kind of go like, this is a really great tusk. I wonder if they've got other great things. They're like, oh, look at that. It's a big floppy ear. But that's what I love about Geico. And that's just what I love the fact that not only have they been doing this for so long, they've been doing so long to be able to do sequels of their own commercials, like 10 years later. I just think is spectacular. And I think is a model that more people can follow. And I don't think it requires the Berkshire Hathaway billions.
Right.
I think what it means is understanding that different parts of your audience are going to see different parts of your work. So for instance, like when I'm working with individuals, like founders, authors, speakers, I would say that 99% of them have no idea that the vast majority of my actual work is with clean tech, life science, pharma, startups, and companies that are in challenger positions. I
was just going to guess all those in that exact order.
I mean, most people and those folks don't really know that I do. Like, so for them, it ends up being like, wow, I'm working with them on their, investor pitches or on their value props and sales conversations. And then they'll say something like, well, we've been invited to do this keynote and we have no idea what to do. And I'm like, oh, I do that. And they're like, wait, what? They feed each other, but that's what I'm saying. I'm not out there going like, hey, I do this thing for everybody, because that would just confuse people. But to like people from organizations with highly technical or, engineering, science, whatever, for those kinds of people or those kinds of products, they often need the most kind of messaging help. And so that's where I do the majority of my organizational work. And I think to the outside, people are like, well, I think if you pull back and understand what I do, why I work with both of those groups of people makes sense, but they don't know about each other really.
A different part of the elephant.
Yeah, it's a different part of the elephant, and it all makes sense to me, and that's all that matters. And I know how to talk to my individual coaching clients so that they know I can help them, and I know how to talk to my organizational clients so that they know I can help them. And when I go speak or present at conferences on this stuff, most of the time that's for the organizational people. But I use this stuff, but as a speaker, that's how I have credibility with my speaker clients, because I know what it's like to have to go get a speech, have to deliver one,
right, and
get paid for it. So it all fits together, but it's, like I said, I'm the only one that it needs to make sense to. But that's why that's why I think Geico and what they do is really a model for what a lot of companies could do and find great benefit from.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're a master at it. And just one more thing on the Geico front, like to put it in perspective, I don't even know what Geico stands for. I'm sure I heard it at some point, but I have no idea what they stand for. What the letters actually stand for. But the slogan is so memorable, and I know exactly what they do. It's just it doesn't even matter that I don't know what it stands, unless it's like some bunch of terrible words like thrown together.
Yeah, I think the I is insurance and the CO is company, and other than that, I think it's it's like the general.
I'm feeling incredibly bright right now about the not realizing CO was company. Wow,
so that's just a guess. Game. Actually, I'm not sure. I think it's one of those things like once upon a time, like in that random reading I do, I was like, oh, it stands for whatever, like LG, like what that originally stood for too. Like I have
Let's Go.
I don't remember, and I don't want to get it wrong.
I'm sure they just named the company that Let's Go.
Yeah.
Yes. So let's go to some rapid fire Q&A to wrap up here. You ready for it?
I'm ready. Go.
All right, let's get wild. What does Geico stand for? No, I'm just kidding.
Dang it.
So you have a very interesting dynamic in that you and your husband Tom are both exceptional and frequent speakers. And by the way, just a plug for you. I know you guys have the Free Noter podcast, which is awesome, and your guys' banter is so brilliant.
Awesome. Thanks.
Reminds me of a previous guest we had, another married couple, Kat and Jethro Gilligan Toth from the Box of Oddities podcast, who they talk about literally the weirdest stuff out there. So completely different ballpark. But again, like there's just something, I think there's something in the water. There's something magical about when a couple or especially married couple has good banter like that over podcast form. I think it could really shine. Anyway.
Well, thank you.
That was a hell of a question for rapid fire.
I was like, define rapid.
So to pull a question out of this, what would you say has been the biggest thing you've learned, or maybe most surprising thing that comes out of both you and your spouse being on the speaking circuit, if you will?
The most surprising thing about us both being on the speaking circuit is that you can have two totally different approaches to how you put talks together, about what you present and how you present it, and still be equally successful.
Bam. All right. That was much better than my question. What is your favorite cocktail?
Oh, good call. God, it changes with the seasons. If I had to pick one and only one to have for all time, it would be a Manhattan.
All right. Shout out Manhattan.
Yep.
You have run many marathons. How many marathons have you ran?
Two.
Oh,
well, yes.
You've run multiple marathons. Well, I was going to ask which was your favorite location to run them in, but I guess that should be pretty easy.
They've both been in Boston. So Boston.
All right. Boston. There we go. Wow. This segment is unbelievable. And I know you have an interest in dancing, ballroom dancing as well.
Yes.
What is your favorite song to dance to? If you had to pick one song.
Sway by Dean Martin.
All right.
That one. Sway.
Thank you so much. You know, I always ask people to sing and nobody ever does. They're like, oh no, I can't do that right now. Wow. Thank you. All right. And then last thing, what is your biggest pet peeve?
Oh gosh. People talking about things that they have no authority to talk about.
That is why I am so fired up about, like raising cats. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I will admit that there's very little that gets me like more annoyed than somebody who's like done a thing for a hot second and being like, well, here's the way to do it. And I'm like, based on what? But
exactly.
Well, we all got to start somewhere.
Yes, exactly. Well, Tamsen, thank you so much. I would pronounce your full Celtic name, but I would totally butcher it. But thank you. This has been a blast. Really appreciate you taking us through your career and your amazing ideas and perspective. Where's the best place for people to connect with you and also to tune into the Freenoter podcast?
Sure. So my stuff is all at tamsenwebster.com. So that's pretty straightforward. You can find links to my newsletter and all that kind of good stuff there. And the Freenoter, you can find that at thefreenoter.com and all places that you listen to podcasts.
Bam. And then last thing, final thoughts. It could be a line. It could be more singing, whatever you want. Send us off here.
Everybody has a great idea somewhere in them. They just need to do the work to find it.
And mine is in my left foot. I just feel it.
Is it? Awesome.
Always making it weird. All right. Thanks, Tamsen.
All right. Thanks, Max.
Hey, if you're not weird, you're... I don't know where I'm going with that. Thank you, Tamsen, for your ideas of the whispering variety. And thank you, wild listeners, for tuning into another episode. If you want to hear more wild stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite app and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. You can also find us on Good Pods, where you can find all the podcasts your friends, family, and more are listening to. In addition, you can dive into our marketing and business growth resources at hippodirect.com/blog and hippodirect.com/newsletter. That newsletter is the Hippo Digest, and it's your place for wild marketing ideas every single week. And of course, come say hey on your favorite social media channels at the handles Hippo Direct and Max Branstetter. Until next time, let your business run wild.
Bring on the bongos!